Welcome to the formulize tutorial video about multiline text boxes. Multiline text boxes are, well, very straightforward sorts of elements that you've no doubt worked with in many forms before. Here we have the animal list form, which we created as part of the linked select box video. And let's just add a multiline text box for recording notes about each animal. So we'll click that and say notes is our caption. And our choices are rows and columns. Those are the main options, and that'll give us, a box, multi-line box that looks like that, more or less. So if we save that, now the element is part of the form, and if we just click on one of our entries in the animal list, there's our notes box. It's that straightforward. So just go back to the list. Let's since this was a newly added element, it's not showing. We already had this page loaded, and that new element was not part of what we were looking at before. So change columns to include it, and now we can see the values that we're going to put in there. So there's various things you can do with the default values. You can use, for example, the user's name as the default value. So if we set that as the default value, and then we went to add an entry, well, then it's going to show my particular name. There are some other things you can use, as it explains down here. The most unusual would be ID or sequence. They will actually not have a value when the entry first appears on the screen, when the form first appears. If we reload this now, you'll see that our default is literally that value. But what happens when we save this is that curly bracket ID is going to be converted to the ID number that this entry has in the database. So as it says here, ID will cause the entry ID number of this entry to be put into the text box. Sequence does something similar. It's just going to cause a ever-increasing sequence of values. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just as people add new entries. So sometimes those are useful if you know some database things and you want to be tracking the primary keys, things like that. Then that's it's useful for that. But if that's all Greek to you, then no need to worry about it. Often, just a tip, when you're using either of those values, you may wish to disable the element because you probably just want formulize to be keeping track of that information rather than the user interacting with it. Obviously, the way this form is right now, somebody could just type something else here. If you're using one of those advanced sort of options, probably want to disable the element, and then it still exists in the form, but it's not something people can interact with. And when we save this, that would be converted to the appropriate number. So the display settings tab is where you can control that. Let's disable it for no one right now. Let's leave it on. The last default value thing that you can do, which is kind of neat, is you can use PHP code to determine the default value. So maybe there's, I'm not sure what you would want to do, but it's obviously going to vary depending on your situation. There isn't really a good example I can think of when it comes to the notes for the animals. This is obviously just a free text box, but just by way of explanation, if we say default equals some default value that we would make up, you put some text in there. So just as a proof of concept, this will interpret that PHP code for us and say, okay, the default is going to be some default value. And so that lets you do more interesting things depending on what your situation is. For example, we could have a few lines of PHP code, and we could say the year equals That's just one way of getting the current year from using PHP. And so we can say get the current year, and the default value for this text box is going to be the year. So let's save that, and then what we get is, well, surprise, the year. So you know, depending on what you're trying to do, you could get quite specific about your default values here. And the same is true in regular text boxes, not just multi-line text boxes. So this can potentially be very useful in you know, you could have a single text box and a single line text box and put in a particular value here. You wouldn't and it could be quite dynamic, and you wouldn't have to have this large big box just to do that. You can do it with a single line box. Associations, not an often used feature. What this option is about is, well, as it says, if you select another element here, then the text that users type in will be compared with the values in that other element. If a match is found, then this will be clickable, and it's going to take you there. So just as an example, let's say let's link it to the time of day. So what we'll do is we'll be comparing the text that's typed in here with the time of day in the activity form. And if there's a match, then we'll be taken to a matching entry. So let's just go back to our list, and let's edit this animal, the wild pig, and let's put in night, save, all done. There is no match on night. This is a rather long, and as I said, it's not an often used, long-winded example, and it's not an often used feature, but there we go. So what that's doing is it's comparing the text morning, which is what we typed into the box, to values in the activity form, and it's found a match in the activity form with this entry. It'll match the first entry that it finds, and so the time of day it was morning in this activity form entry. So we end up with a link from the animal list to there. Depending on your data, that may be useful if you want people to be able to jump from here to another source. But as I say, that's not often used. Text boxes have the same kind of association possible. Last thing that I'll mention, just and it's a way of tying up loose ends, but also not too relevant to most people. If you are using the ID or sequence, or you're doing a PHP value that results in a number, you just want to be careful that you're actually treating numeric values as numbers. This is one situation where you would want to be very careful about that. So if you are using those particular features, you probably want to change the advanced setting here to store as a number with no decimal places. If you don't store values as numeric in the database, then when you try to perform numeric options on them, like say an increasing sequence, adding 1 every time, problems will happen. So if you are using some of these advanced features, and you do need it to be a number, make sure you specifically tell it on the advanced tab that you want to store this data as a number. So that's about it. There really isn't there's a whole lot that you can say obviously about them, but for the most part they're very simple: rows, columns, and some different options for default values.